There's a book I want to walk you through today. It's called End Times, with the subtitle Elites, Counter-Elites, and the Path of Political Disintegration. The author is Peter Turchin, a professor who splits his time between Oxford and the Complexity Science Hub in Vienna. But his background is not what you'd expect for someone writing about the collapse of civilizations. He started his career as an ecologist, studying predator-prey population dynamics in the natural world. At some point, he began to wonder, if you can model why deer populations crash and recover in cycles, why can't you apply the same mathematical tools to human societies? That question sent him down a path that consumed the next 2 decades of his life. Along with a team of historians, anthropologists, and data scientists, Turchin built something called Seshet, named after the ancient Egyptian goddess of knowledge and record-keeping. It's one of the most ambitious historical databases ever constructed, a structured dataset covering hundreds of societies across the past 10,000 years, coding everything from tax rates and military capacity to income inequality and political violence. The goal was to treat history not as a collection of stories, but as data, and to find the patterns hiding inside it. What they found was unsettling. All complex societies, whether ancient China, medieval France, or modern America, fall into serious political crisis periodically. And what drives these crises is not random. It's the same set of structural forces, repeating across cultures and centuries, like a recurring equation the human species hasn't yet learned to solve. Turchin calls this discipline cliodynamics, the mathematical study of historical dynamics. And the core argument of End Times is his attempt to translate that research in a plain language for a general audience. His formula is social collapse equals elite overproduction plus popular immiseration. When a society simultaneously generates a surplus of elites and sees ordinary people getting economically squeezed, that society is heading not just toward instability, but toward potential collapse. And America today has both conditions fully in place. What makes Turchin especially credible isn't just the elegance of the theory. It's a prediction he made over a decade before anyone was talking about this. In 2010, the journal Nature invited leading scientists to look ahead at the coming decade. Turchin published a short piece saying that around 2020, based on his models, the United States would hit a peak of political instability. Most readers probably filed it away and forgot about it. 10 years later, on January 6, 2021, a mob stormed the U.S. Capitol. Political polarization reached levels not seen since the Civil War. So let's take his framework seriously and walk through it piece by piece. Variable 1. Popular immiseration. This one is relatively intuitive. Since the 1970s, the American economy has kept growing, but the share going to ordinary workers stopped growing. It actually shrank. Turchin uses a metric called relative wages, average worker wages divided by GDP per capita. Before the 1960s, this number rose steadily. American workers were genuinely getting better off year by year. Then it turned sharply downward, and by around 2010 it had nearly halved. Economic growth continued. The fruits of that growth flowed almost entirely to the top. The share going to ordinary people was roughly half what it had been 50 years earlier. This shows up even in physical terms. In the 18th century, Americans were the tallest people in the world. That held until the 1960s. Since then, Americans have stopped getting taller, while the Dutch, Swedes, and Germans kept growing. The tallest populations in the world today are in Northern Europe. More alarming, American life expectancy started declining before the COVID pandemic. A study by 2 economists found it fell for 3 consecutive years, beginning in 2014, something that had never happened since complete statistical records began in 1933. Deaths from alcoholism, drug overdose, and suicide surged sharply among Americans without a college degree. Researchers gave this a name: deaths of despair. It's a phrase you now encounter constantly in American media. The condition of ordinary Americans has clearly deteriorated over the past half-century. Most serious researchers agree on this. But here's Turchin's key move. He argues this alone is not what drives a society to the breaking point. People struggling at the bottom is a constant throughout history. What actually triggers collapse is the second variable. Variable 2, elite overproduction. This is where the book gets genuinely counterintuitive and, in my view, where it becomes most important. Turchin describes it with a musical chairs analogy. Imagine 18 chairs representing 10 powerful positions, congressional seats, CEO roles, senior law firm partnerships, the kinds of seats that confer real power and status. The game is to grab one of those chairs when the music stops. At the start, 11 players are competing for 10 seats. It's competitive, but manageable. The rules hold. Then the number of chairs stays fixed, but the players multiply. 11 becomes 20, then 30. There's still only 10 winners, but now there are 20 losers, then 30. And here's the critical moment. As the competition intensifies, some players start breaking the rules. They sit down before the music stops. They push someone else out of their chair. When that happens, Turchin says something fundamental shifts. That person has just transformed from an elite aspirant into an anti-elite, someone who wants to overturn the whole table. And the anti-elite, he argues, is the central character of our current historical moment. Is this just a metaphor? No. Turchin demonstrates it's already happening in the United States, across two distinct tracks. Track 1, the wealth elite. In 1983, after adjusting for inflation, there were about 66,000 American households with net assets over $10 million. By 2019, that number had reached 693,000, a tenfold increase. Over the same period, the total number of U.S. households grew by only 53%. Turchin calls the mechanism driving this a wealth pump, a system that structurally transfers wealth upward from workers to owners year after year. Since the 1970s, the U.S. labor market was hit by several converging forces. The baby boom generation flooding the workforce, large numbers of women entering paid employment, and significant immigration. Simultaneously, globalization moved manufacturing jobs overseas, and automation eliminated another wave of lower-skill work. Labor supply vastly outpaced demand. Workers' bargaining power collapsed. At the same moment, the institutions protecting workers were being dismantled. From the Reagan era onward, unions were systematically weakened. The federal minimum wage was steadily eroded by inflation. Collective bargaining became largely hollow in practice. Result, the economy kept growing, but workers' share of it stopped. Growth was captured almost entirely at the top. The bottom got poorer, popular immiseration. But simultaneously, vast new wealth was being accumulated at the top, and more of those wealthy individuals wanted political power. They wanted into the game. Yet the number of congressional seats didn't increase. There's still only one president. The difficulty of the chair-grabbing game went straight up. In 1990, winning a House seat cost a candidate an average of $400,000. By 2020, that figure had risen to $2.35 million. Senate races climbed from $3.9 million to $27 million. The number of wealthy candidates self-funding campaigns with over $1 million of their own money nearly doubled between 2001 and 2018. More players, higher stakes, deteriorating norms. The 2016 Republican primary, 17 major candidates in a single field, the largest in modern history, was the logical result. The race descended into a competition over who could be most outrageous, because outrage was the only reliable way to capture media attention in a field that crowded. Candidates who maintained their dignity lost, one after another. Track 2, the academic elite. This track is more hidden and possibly more dangerous. American society holds a deep belief: a college degree changes your life trajectory. In the 1950s, that was largely true. Fewer than 15% of young people graduated from college, and a degree was essentially a guaranteed entry into the middle class. Today, 2/3 of young Americans attend college. The chairs haven't multiplied to match, but the number of players has. So the ante keeps rising. To stand out, you now need graduate school, law school, a PhD. Doctoral degrees awarded by American universities tripled between 1960 and 1970, from under 10,000 to 30,000. Law school enrollment also tripled between 1955 and 1975. But the jobs that actually require these credentials did not grow at anything close to that pace. Look at what happened to starting salary distributions among U.S. law graduates around 2000. The curve transformed dramatically. Instead of a normal bell curve, it split into a two-peak distribution. The spike on the right, $190,000, roughly 20% of graduates, the ones who landed positions at elite law firms. The spike on the left, $45,000 to $75,000, roughly half of all graduates, and almost nothing in between. Now, $45,000 to $75,000 sounds acceptable until you factor in that among 2020 law graduates, half were carrying student loan debt over $160,000, and 1 in 4 owed more than $200,000. Those left spike graduates aren't just non-elite. They're credentialed, exhausted, and financially trapped, potentially for decades. Turchin calls this the educated precariat. And through the Seshet database and historical research, he found that this specific class, highly educated people with blocked ambitions and economic precarity, is precisely the most volatile and destabilizing in history. It drove the European revolutions of the mid-19th century. It fueled the Arab Spring in 2011. Again and again, across very different cultures, the same profile appears at the center of social upheaval. And across all occupations, one profession has historically produced revolutionary leaders at the highest rate: lawyers. Robespierre was a lawyer. Lenin was a lawyer. Castro was a lawyer. Gandhi was a lawyer. Lincoln was a lawyer. Think about the size of America's current army of indebted, frustrated law school graduates. And consider that some of the leaders of the next major American political disruption are probably already among them. The psychology of elite competition. Turchin points to something even more subtle. Elite overproduction doesn't just hurt the losers. It warps the psychology of the winners too. He cites research by psychologist Robert Evans on America's top private schools. Evans found that the most striking change in recent years is pervasive parental anxiety. These are parents who are genuinely powerful and accomplished, people who feel fully in control of their professional lives. But they apply that same high-pressure, maximum resource approach to raising their children. Every extracurricular, every tutor, every achievement is engineered toward a single goal: an Ivy League application. What's driving this, Evans found, is not ambition. It's fear. These parents worry that their children won't be able to hold the position they inherited. The game is getting crueler. Even a top university may not be enough to secure an elite seat for the next generation. The 2019 college admission scandal, where wealthy parents paid hundreds of thousands in bribes to get their children into Stanford, Yale, and Georgetown, was not an aberration. It was a symptom. When competition reaches this intensity, the system doesn't select for the most talented or capable. It selects for the most ruthless. Extreme competition doesn't optimize the elite. It corrupts it. Meet Jake. To illustrate how elite overproduction creates anti-elites, Turchin introduces a composite character he calls Jake, a fictional figure, but one he insists is drawn detail by detail from real individuals he interviewed and researched. Jake grew up in a wealthy Upper Manhattan family. His father is a senior partner at a major law firm. His mother runs a prominent nonprofit. He attended New York's most exclusive private schools. That upbringing wasn't a golden childhood. It was a pressure cooker. Every child was being driven relentlessly toward college admissions. Parents would argue with teachers for 40 minutes over a single test score. Chronic anxiety was normal. Some students couldn't sleep without medication. Jake got what his parents wanted: admission to Columbia. But once there, he felt a profound emptiness. He could see the rest of his life already scripted. For years of undergrad, 3 years of law school, decades at a corporate firm, defending the same clients his father defended. Large corporations, often against the interests of ordinary people. He switched directions. He spent time studying Latin American history, then took 3 months in a rural Guatemalan village. The material poverty was stark, but the warmth and generosity he encountered there, the willingness to share what little people had, created a jarring contrast with the anxiety-saturated competitive world he'd grown up in. He came back changed. He joined radical student organizations at Columbia. He participated in Occupy Wall Street. During the police clearance, he watched a veteran of the Iraq War get struck in the skull with a rubber bullet. That moment crystallized something. And then, the unexpected turn. He enrolled at Yale Law School, not to become a corporate lawyer, to get into politics. He wants to run for district attorney, then higher office. His long-term vision is a world without mass incarceration, without the prison system as we know it. And he intends to pursue this not through revolution, but from inside the system, through elections, through policy, through dismantling institutions one law at a time. What does Jake represent in Turchin's framework? He's not a loser who couldn't grab a chair. With his family background and resources, he could have walked straight into the elite. What radicalized him wasn't economic failure. It was the cruelty and moral bankruptcy of the competition itself, and a deepening conviction that the whole game is a form of systemic violence. This type, Turchin argues, is often more dangerous to social stability than simple losers because they have resources, education, and organizational capacity, and they carry a sense of moral urgency that makes them tireless. Jake is the composite of the radical left anti-elite. On the right, you have a real-world mirror image in Steve Bannon. Born working class, earned a Georgetown master's and a Harvard MBA, worked at Goldman Sachs, and came away from that experience not with insider comfort, but with a deep contempt for the establishment. He calls himself a Leninist. His stated goal is the destruction of the existing institutional order. Jake and Bannon disagree on almost everything, but they share a structural identity. Former insiders or near insiders who have turned against the system and are working to bring it down. Between those two poles sits a much larger population of anxious, frustrated near elites, people who haven't gone that far, but who are increasingly receptive to anyone who speaks their frustration. When figures like these start channeling bottom-up popular anger to serve their own ambitions, that's the moment a society genuinely reaches the edge. 2 case studies, Ukraine and Belarus. In 2014, Ukraine's Maidan revolution looked from the outside like a popular uprising. But look more closely. After the Soviet collapse, Ukraine's economy had been divided among a small group of oligarchs. When President Yanukovych began consolidating wealth into his own family's hands, threatening the other oligarchs, those rivals withdrew their support overnight. TV stations they controlled switched allegiances. Their allies in parliament defected. Security forces split at the top, stood down. Yanukovych's entire power structure collapsed in days. The popular protests were real, but the collapse was an elite fracture. Compare Belarus in 2020. Massive popular protests erupted, comparable to Ukraine in scale and intensity. But Belarus had not undergone significant privatization. There were no rival oligarchs. The elite remained unified. And so, no matter how large or sustained the protests, the security forces held. The Lukashenko regime survived. Side by side, these 2 cases make Turchin's point concrete. Popular anger is the spark. Elite fracture is the gunpowder. Without the second, the first goes nowhere. The mid-19th century, America has been here before. Here's where the historical analysis becomes genuinely striking, and where the Seshet database earns its keep. Turchin finds that the United States has been in almost exactly this structural situation once before, the decade of the 1850s, leading up to the Civil War. And the data is remarkably parallel. In the antebellum period, the U.S. population exploded from 5 million to 23 million, severely oversupplying the labor market. From the 1820s to the 1860s, relative wages for American workers fell by nearly 50%, almost exactly mirroring the decline from the 1970s to today. Average life expectancy fell by 8 years. Recorded deadly urban riots went from roughly 1 every 5 years in the early 1820s to 38 in the late 1850s. Anti-immigrant sentiment surged. The political culture coarsened dramatically. On the elite side, around 1800, there were only a handful of millionaires in America. $1 million then was roughly equivalent to $1 billion today. By 1850, there were approximately 100, drawn from new industrial fortunes in mining, railroads, and steel. These new elites were in direct conflict with the established Southern plantation aristocracy. Their economic interests were fundamentally opposed. Industrialists wanted high protective tariffs and federal investment in infrastructure. Planters wanted low export tariffs on cotton and minimal federal involvement in commerce. The elite was fracturing along a structural fault line. Meanwhile, legal education was rapidly expanding, producing a flood of ambitious lawyers, the primary route into American political life. More aspirants, the same number of seats. The House of Representatives had not meaningfully grown since 1835. In 1856, a South Carolina congressman walked onto the Senate floor and beat a political enemy nearly to death with a cane. On another occasion, a pistol fell from a congressman's pocket in the chamber and nearly triggered shooting. Into this situation walked Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln came from nothing, genuinely humble origins, self-educated from rural Illinois. He had lost more elections than he'd won, had suffered what today we'd probably call a breakdown, and had seriously considered leaving politics entirely. On the eve of the 1860 election, few observers thought he had a real chance at the presidency. But Lincoln had precisely identified the intersection of the two structural forces at play. On the elite side, he represented the emerging industrial and commercial interests of the North, which needed an agent to break the Southern planter class's grip on federal power. On the popular side, he channeled a very specific economic anxiety. Northern white working-class fear that the expansion of slavery into new territories would force free laborers to compete with enslaved labor, destroying their livelihoods. Notice the framing. This was not primarily a moral campaign in Lincoln's early political platform, though he had genuine personal convictions about slavery. It was an economic argument. His early platform called not for abolition, but for the containment of slavery's expansion. The target was not slavery itself, but the political monopoly of the slaveholding elite. This is a textbook case of what Turchin calls anti-elite mobilization, a surplus elite aspirant who accurately channels the economic anxiety of the base and deploys it against the entrenched power structure. Lincoln, operating against almost every structural disadvantage, won the presidency. The South seceded. 600,000 people died. The structural parallels with Trump are direct and deliberate on Turchin's part. In 2016, Trump entered a primary field of 17 candidates. Almost no credible analyst gave him a realistic path to the nomination, let alone the presidency. He won by channeling the economic anxiety of Rust Belt working-class voters, fear of job losses, to globalization and immigration. Structurally, this is the same fear Lincoln's Northern workers held, the fear of being economically displaced by a force beyond your control. Two impossible candidates, produced by the same structural conditions, separated by a century and a half. Even the contemporary reception is parallel. Trump is among the most polarizing figures in modern American history. Read the newspapers of Lincoln's presidency, and you'll find he was perhaps the most vilified president while in office in American history, attacked with a ferocity that would surprise most people today. China at the same moment. This is worth pausing on, because it illustrates how universal these dynamics actually are. While America was spiraling towards civil war in the 1850s, China, under the Qing dynasty, was running the identical structural script. The population had quadrupled over the preceding century, but the imperial examination system, the gateway to official positions and elite status, was producing vastly more qualified candidates than there were posts to fill. The number of official positions had barely grown. Hong Xiuquan, who failed the imperial examinations 4 times, eventually founded the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom and mobilized tens of millions of impoverished peasants. What followed became the bloodiest civil war in recorded human history, with deaths estimated between 20 and 30 million. Among the top leadership of the Taiping movement, more than half were failed examination candidates, the surplus elites of their era. Same formula, different civilization, same century, same outcome. This is exactly the kind of cross-cultural pattern that the Sechet database was built to surface. The academic controversy. Before we get to Turchin's conclusions, it's worth acknowledging that his framework is not without critics, and the criticisms are serious enough to take into account. Some historians argue that elite overproduction is too loosely defined to be rigorously measured. How exactly do you count surplus elites? Where's the threshold? The precision of a mathematical model can obscure how much judgment is baked into the data coding. Others argue that cliodynamics is reductive, that it turns the immense complexity of historical events in a formula, and in doing so, evacuates the role of contingency, individual decisions, and plain luck. A different general at Gettysburg, a different outcome at a key primary, and the entire trajectory changes in ways no model could have predicted. Turchin's response to this is measured. He doesn't claim to predict specific events. The model identifies structural conditions, pressure that's building. Whether that pressure releases through reform, war, or some other path is where contingency enters. The model tells you the terrain, it doesn't tell you which road gets taken. His 2010 prediction of instability peaking around 2020 is often cited as vindication. It's striking, but his critics would note that predicting political instability will increase in a decade is a somewhat broad claim, and that the specific mechanism he identified may not fully account for why things unfolded the way they did. These are fair debates. They don't invalidate the framework, but they're worth holding in mind as you evaluate it. Where does this end? Turchin and his team analyzed 100 historical social crises from the Sechet database and tracked how each resolved. The aggregate results are sobering. 75% ended in revolution or civil war. 60% led to some form of state dissolution, absorbed by foreign power or fractured internally. 40% of rulers were assassinated. In nearly two-thirds of cases, the elite experienced massive downward mobility. In 1 in 6 cases, the elite class became the target of systematic purges. Very few crises produced a genuine soft landing. But the ones that did share a common feature, the elite, under enormous pressure, chose to make real concessions. Not symbolic gestures, not charity, not rhetoric, but structural reform. They actually shut down the wealth pump. Britain in the 19th century is the clearest success story, facing serious popular hardship and sharp elite conflicts. With workers' real wages declining since 1750, Britain was genuinely close to revolution. Over roughly 50 years of sustained political pressure, the elite retreated in stages, extending voting rights in 1832, repealing the Corn Laws that artificially inflated food prices, permitting workers to organize. By 1867, when suffrage was extended to all male citizens, the most dangerous phase had passed. After 1850, British workers' real wages turned upward and roughly doubled over the following 50 years. America did it once, too. The crisis of the early 20th century, extreme inequality, political violence, social fragmentation, was resolved through the progressive movement and Roosevelt's New Deal. Collective bargaining rights, Social Security, income tax rates above 90% on the highest earners. These reforms forcibly shut down the wealth pump. What followed was the Great Compression, sharply narrowed inequality, a rapidly expanding middle class, and roughly half a century of broadly shared prosperity. But Turchin is clear-eyed about the limits of this. There's a principle in sociology, the iron law of oligarchy, which holds that any group that accumulates sufficient power will inevitably redirect that power toward its own interests. Even successful reforms erode. The New Deal, equilibrium, lasted about 40 years before a new generation of elites began systematically dismantling it. Britain's gains started reversing in the mid-1970s. The wealth pump, once turned off, eventually gets turned back on. There is no permanent solution. There's only the recurring question: does the current generation of elites have enough self-awareness and enough genuine concern for the broader social fabric to make real concessions before the moment passes? Where America stands now. Turchin's model places America at a structural crossroads analogous to where it stood in the late 1850s. Last time, the path led to the Civil War. The early 20th century crisis was narrowly averted through genuine reform. This time, the wealth pump is still running at full speed. Popular hardship is deepening. Elite overproduction is accelerating. The resonance between those two forces is growing louder every election cycle. Trump, in this reading, is not a cause. He's a product. What Turchin calls a political entrepreneur, someone who accurately identified the rage of roughly 90% of the country that had been abandoned by both parties and used the Republican Party as a vehicle to channel it. His record in office is genuinely contradictory: anti-immigration, anti-free trade, skeptical of NATO, willing to break with Republican economic orthodoxy in ways that do challenge certain elite interests, but also willing to deliver enormous tax advantages to the wealthy. He is simultaneously challenging the establishment and courting it. Whether this moment ultimately produces genuine structural reform or merely a reshuffling of which elites hold power, Turchin says the outcome is genuinely uncertain. A society in structural crisis is like a ball rolling downhill into open terrain. Many paths are possible. A well-timed push in the right place can change the direction. But you need to know where to push, and someone in a position to push has to be willing to do it. The historical record of soft landings has one consistent prerequisite: enough members of the elite who are willing to sacrifice short-term advantage for real structural change. Not charity dinners, not public statements, actually dismantling the mechanisms that funnel growth upward and away from everyone else. American elites managed it once in the last century. Turchin ends the book with something close to a genuine plea. He writes that complex human societies need elites to function. They need managers, decision-makers, people with the resources and capacity to lead institutions. The goal is not to eliminate elites. The goal is to constrain them, to build the political and institutional conditions that make it possible for elites to serve the interests of everyone, not just themselves. Easy to say, genuinely difficult to do. And based on 5,000 years of data compiled in the Seshat archive, the societies that couldn't figure it out, the vast majority, did not end well.